The sound of praise for your Sunday morning.
The only one who could ever teach me
Introducing Reverend A.R. Bernard of the Christian Cultural Center
was the son of a preacher man.
and Rabbi Joseph Potasnik of Religion on the Line.
The only one who could ever teach me.
Now on Talk Radio 77 WABC. Here's the Rev and the Rabbi, where faith matters.
Good morning, I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
Rev, I've learned there are 3 stages of life that you and I can relate to. 1, youth. 2, middle age. 3, you're looking good.
I like that. I like that. But wait a minute. So when someone tells me I'm looking good, they're telling me I'm old or what?
Well, you can interpret that. I've never heard, we go right from middle age to you looking good. I've never heard an in-between. So, whatever fits for you, Rev and me, we have to accept it. We've been doing this a number of years. We love it, but we also know that, you and I talk about experience, and I often mention Ed Towns. Ed Towns had that great line. He was in Congress, and he says, when I first arrived here, I railed against that seniority system. Who are these older guys to take over, to rule, to dominate? Now that I'm a senior, what a brilliant system that is. It is so, so important to have, seniority. And
Yep.
And as we get older, we learn. I asked you the other day, how long did it take you to prepare that? And what'd you say? A lifetime?
My whole life,
Yeah.
right? That's after I came out of the pulpit. You were standing there next to me in the front row.
Yeah.
And that was a great question, though, and the timing was perfect. But let me ask you a question, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Here we have this platform. We've been at this for quite a few years,
Right.
right? I would say a reasonable number of years. And we have this platform to speak to so many people who tune in. And as clergymen representing our respective faith traditions, we have a prophetic responsibility in terms of how we use our voice and how we weigh in on these things. But I would say that our prophetic responsibility must be balanced with a moral responsibility. Do you agree? And if so, why?
Absolutely. I think when you read the prophets, their exhortations, their teachings were predicated on moral behavior. After you finish a book of the prophets, or you finish a chapter of the prophets, you recognize the recurrent theme is that you have to be better. That good is not the final stage. Good has to be replaced by better. Someone once said to me, the definition of a good Jew is one who seeks to be a better Jew. And I think that's true of all of our faiths. I thought to myself when I sat through your services at CCC, Christian Cultural Center, there is a psalm, I think it's Psalm 100, it says, serve God with joy. And I said, here you are coming in, and you're giving that message, that prophetic message, but you're doing it in a way that is replete with celebration. The music, the singing, people love being there. It's a positive experience. So you can be prophetic and positive simultaneously. You don't have to be an angry guy. And I found that very, very refreshing.
Well, I appreciate that. And when we look at the prophets in the Hebrew scriptures, the prophets gave an analysis. They also gave a warning of judgment. But behind the warning of judgment, there was also hope. And the hope was greater than the judgment. And that's the pattern. And that's the pattern that we should follow. So when we come together on a Sunday morning, which is our first day of a new week, we come to celebrate God's love, God's life, and God's light. And, other traditions or expressions within our Christian tradition can do it differently. It can be very quiet and, all of that. But we want to celebrate love, life, and light. And it was just great to have you there with us.
You know what? It's the same of Jewish tradition. I always tell rabbis, having been a rabbi a number of years, when people walk out, you better see them walk out with that hope, with that smile, because there's enough ugliness in the world that they don't have to be beat up by it day after day. And when they come to services, if they don't get hope there, then where are they going to get it today? So that's why when I sit through a Jewish service, when I sat through your service, I walked away and I said, with everything going on, there's still hope for tomorrow. And,
Amen to that. That's good preaching, Rabbi.
Thank you. By the way, we have somebody coming on today, Jeff Jacoby, whom you and I have known for some time, and really has an intellectual insight. He's got a great grasp of history and is able to present in a very meaningful way. So, it's always good to have someone who's a teacher because we believe teaching is something that is ongoing. You never learn enough. You're always a student, and to be a student of Jacoby is a very positive thing.
Yeah, so stay tuned for more of the Rev and the Rabbi right here on 77 WABC Sunday mornings. We'll be right back.
Where faith matters. The Rev and the Rabbi. Talk Radio 77 WABC.
Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
Reverend, as a former Bostonian, I welcome from the great state of Massachusetts, renowned journalist, respected syndicated columnist, Jeff Jacoby.
That's a lot of adjectives, but I'm glad to be
well deserved, Jeff. We haven't spoken to you in a while, and there's so much to talk about, so thanks for being with us.
Sure.
So, Jeff, let me ask you very candidly. Here we are, 75 plus years after the Holocaust, and we're talking about anti-Semitism. Did you think we would be at this point at this time?
Did I think it would be at this point at this time? No, I certainly didn't anticipate how deep the rot had gone and how wide it had spread. I will say that for more than 20 years, I have written columns about the eruption of anti-Semitism. Mostly I was focused on Europe, where it seemed to be, going back to the early 2000s, it seemed to be appearing more and more virulently. I clearly could see that there was a problem in this country on the political extremes, on the far left and on the far right. From time to time, there was reason to write about it. I thought I understood the subject pretty well, but I have to say, even I was shocked after October 7, the worst day of violence against Jews since the Holocaust, that the reaction in so many parts of this country, so many parts of the world, was a surge, an explosion of celebrating the attack on Jews, the attack on the Jewish state, and calling for more of it. That it shocked me to see just how extensive it was. So no, I've never been a Pollyanna about this, but I never expected that it would get so bad so quickly and so widely.
Yeah, coupled with silence from many people who didn't say anything.
Jeff, you said what you thought you understood. What did you discover you didn't understand? Since October 7th, I've certainly come to understand more the way in which the appearance of Jew hatred or hatred of a Jewish state fuels more of that very hatred. To a number of people, I tried to make the analogy so that they could understand why this was so shocking to so many of us in the Jewish community. Imagine, I said, that in the immediate wake of the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, when the cop killed him kneeling on his neck, and the whole country exploded in outrage and the denunciation of racism and fury at police brutality. Imagine, I said, that the reaction was the opposite, that the country did, in fact, explode and that there were demonstrations and protests everywhere, but that the demonstrators were calling for killing more people in this fashion. Imagine that the outrage was directed not at what the police officer had done, but at anything that George Floyd or any other person being held by the police might try to do to defend themselves. That's what this has felt like. If there had been widespread outrage in this country, and I mean, obviously there was, but we're talking about the eruptions on college campuses and in Dearborn, Michigan, and in downtown demonstrations everywhere.
imagine. It's so hard to imagine that this would be the same kind of reaction to an act of overt racism or an act of hostility and violence against women that anybody would be calling. Imagine that there was a terrible case of a terrible spate of child rapes in this country. Who could imagine there would be protests calling for even more of them, or defending the rapists, or saying that the victims had it coming? And yet that's exactly what we've seen so much of in the wake of October 7. That's something that I truly didn't understand. One other thing I would point to, you alluded to it, is the extent to which so many people simply don't get it, simply don't understand how grave and alarming and frightening this is. Now, I understand there's a lot of terrible things that happen in the world, every day of the year. And I understand that people can't be concerned with everything, and that there are all kinds of things that, that you and I and every one of our listeners, like we might pick up on it in our peripheral vision, but it's not something that consumes us. So I understand that. But when you read story after story after story about American Jews whose formerly close allies and friends and supporters and business acquaintances and fellow students suddenly find themselves abandoned or isolated, not only are they not getting sympathy, they're getting overt hostility. I think that's something also that, that as well as I thought I understood this subject, that's not something that I was expecting to see, certainly not in the United States, and certainly not so quickly.
Look at the college campuses. We've always said education is the answer, and yet we have so-called educated people who are, putting up the encampments and saying Hitler was right and all of the other ugly statements that they're making. How do you explain that? I mean,
I'll tell you, I've never actually believed that cliche about how education is the answer. I've always been very dubious about all the states where they pass laws to mandate Holocaust education units in public schools. I've always been very dubious about that. My general observation over the years has been that you don't inculcate outrage and shock and dismay and a moral sense of revulsion against what Hitler and the Nazis did by teaching the facts of it. You inculcate that kind of revulsion and that kind of reaction by working on developing students' moral and ethical fiber. You inculcate it by making them into good, starting as good children and trying to teach them how to become good adults. And the idea that somehow the more educated you are, the more likely or the more reliably it'll be that you'll oppose violence against Jews, I mean, that's just completely contradicted by everything that we know in history. The final solution was not planned and carried out by ignorant boors who never went to school. Most of the people at the Wannsee conference, when the final solution, that the extermination of the Jews, was given the go-ahead, most of the people around the table, in Nazi Germany, were people with PhDs. Same thing we see in this country, in the college campuses. For years, there's been a project on the left to undermine basic tenets of Western civilization. And is it really such a surprise that it's in many ways from the most educated factions of society that you see this kind of thing take hold? I remember there's a line, I can't remember who said it, but a line that I've heard, that some ideas are so idiotic that you have to have a graduate degree to believe in them. And, I think that maybe there's an element of that here as well. To truly believe that the Jews are, there was a poll that was done, the Harris poll, the Harvard Harris poll, and it found that something like 2/3 of Americans under the age of 30 agree with the statement that Jews as a class are oppressors. Now, to believe that the most oppressed people in human history are oppressors, that doesn't come to people with, as we say, neither seichel. That's not common sense. That's something you have to be taught. And so I would say, far from the solution to anti-Semitism being more education, I would say very often bad education has been the cause of it.
That's interesting because there are those who would say, and I tend to lean in their direction, that this generation has a very shallow historical perspective. They really don't take a look at history in its expansive view to understand the things that lead up to the current context and the current situations.
But
So
in fairness, is that so different from our generation or the generation before that? If you were asked, a bunch of basic questions about, the War of 1812, would you be, how prepared would you be to answer those questions? I'm not surprised. The Holocaust for most people, for me, the Holocaust is something intensely personal. My father survived Auschwitz. His family was murdered there. So, nobody will ever have to convince me that the Holocaust is something of vital importance and that it's imperative to know about it and to keep people aware of it. But I understand, I recognize that for most people, it's history now. It's 80 years already since the death camps were liberated. 80 years since it was over. How many other events from 80 years ago, even enormous events, are really top of mind for most Americans? World War I was a staggering event in American and world history. It decimated an entire generation. It had a profound effect on politics and culture in the years afterward. How many people, if you took 1,000 people at random, 1,000 adults, 1,000 college students, 1,000 professors, if you like, and asked them 10 or 15 basic questions about World War I? Mm-hmm. You really think they would be, would you be impressed by the knowledge with which they would answer, or dismayed by the lack of knowledge with which they would answer? So as much as I, at one level emotionally believe strongly and never forget when it comes to the Holocaust, at the same time, I can't pretend that this isn't what always happens with terrible events in human history. It recedes. Henry Ford, who was no great moral champion in America, but Henry Ford once said something like, "History is bunk." I think for most Americans, even if they wouldn't put it that crudely, I think most people, most of the time, do regard history, if not as bunk, then at least as not really relevant to their lives. You studied the War of 1812 in grade school. Then when you're out of grade school, nobody ever asks you about it again. I don't know that the Holocaust is any different.
Let's go to something.
Is it also...
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, just a follow-up question. Is it also that we are in a space where we're challenging the accuracy of how history has been recorded and reported, especially here in America, that we are revisiting history? And for that reason, it doesn't carry the same kind of authority or influence? I'm just curious to hear what you have to say.
That's a good insight. I think it's a really thoughtful point. When you're growing up like Generation Z people today, or even younger than that in school, and everything they hear is kind of a revisionist view of what previous generations of Americans were taught. Yeah, I think you might be right. It does have this kind of corrosive effect on their willingness to believe or to take anything at face value, and then multiply all that by the effect of the internet. The internet, the digital revolution, has made it easier than ever before in human history to spread lies and rumors and conspiracy theories and distortions. It's never been so easy to spread so much misinformation. And I mean, we've all seen the polls. How many people, say that they get their main source of information is Instagram and TikTok? Well, if that's where you're learning about the world from, it's no wonder that you have a very jaded view of the world.
Yeah. Let's go to something less controversial, Joe. Let's talk about the election. So, I was speaking with one of our loyal listeners, former FDNY Commissioner Salvatore Cassato, talking about campaigning and the mudslinging that goes on. And we believe that people should want to know issues, not smearing of individuals, but they should want to know issues. And yet, no matter what we say or what we believe, you turn on the TV, you read the reports, and there's this back and forth mudslinging. Does that sell? At the end of the day, is that what works?
I think it is what works. More and more, it's what works. I mean, at one level, you could say all through American history, presidential elections, pretty much since George Washington left office, every presidential election since then at least to some extent, has been waged on a personal level. There's been personal mudslinging. What John Adams' people and Thomas Jefferson's people said about each other back in the election of 1800 or 1804. Pretty shocking. But yet, we know that there's clearly been a qualitative difference. The kind of things that candidates will say today, the language that they'll use, the vulgarity, the nastiness, the crudeness, it's impossible to imagine. I mean, you don't have to go back that far in time. It's impossible to imagine George W. Bush and Al Gore demonizing each other personally with the kind of language that we see, that has come out of Trump or out of the Harris campaign, or before her, out of Joe Biden. Again, I think to some extent this is a reflection of the internet and the way it has coarsened society in so many ways. And every little step, every further step downward sets a new norm. And what becomes, what became normal 4 years ago. Okay, so from there they go down a little bit more each time. You asked, does it work? From everything that I've seen, all the information, at least up until maybe things have changed a little bit with the Harris nomination, we'll see. But certainly in the past 2 or 3 election cycles, voters overwhelmingly said, when they were interviewed and analyzed and surveyed by researchers, they overwhelmingly expressed the idea that they were voting primarily based on the candidate that they were against rather than the candidate that they were for. The scholars call it negative partisanship. It's not so much that they love their own party or they love their own candidate, but that they hate the candidate on the other side. And I never thought that I would see so many. We've talked about this before. People that I regarded as thoughtful, sensible, reasonable Republicans or Republican-leaning voters who would embrace and cheer the kind of ugly rhetoric that comes out of someone like Donald Trump. And what gets said about Trump from the other side is even more poisonous. So, yeah, I'm afraid it does work. Listen, when was the last time you saw a positive campaign ad on TV? Fortunately, I live in Massachusetts, so nobody bothers to advertise here because the results are all, it's all a foregone conclusion. But because New Hampshire, southern New Hampshire is in the Boston media market, sometimes I do see ads that are aimed at, it's about New Hampshire campaigns, and it's aimed at New Hampshire voters. And I would say 99 times out of 100, when I see an ad like that, it's a negative ad. It's always designed to elicit negative emotions about anger, emotions about resentment, emotions about jealousy, and to shape people's votes that way. So, yeah, I think there was a lot of wisdom when George Washington in his farewell address warned Americans to stay away from political parties and political factions. Unfortunately, human nature is what it is, and we've been a very partisan society for a very long time.
I like the fact that you pointed out emotion and anger, because that's what's driving a lot of the conversation. Not facts, not truth, but emotion. And I was talking to one individual, and I said, well, the reason I like Donald Trump is because he is saying what I would love to say to the American government. So they want to say, shove it up your, you know what I mean? And he says it. And based on that, he's one of us. I'll vote for him.
And I guess I can believe that there are people who find that a selling point. To me, that just makes a candidate like that more unacceptable. I want to see a president who will have something presidential about him. Somebody who will have a little bit of humility. Somebody who will have some what we used to call gravitas. They don't use that word much anymore. But I don't want a president of the United States, or for that matter, a senator or a congressman, who goes for the lowest common denominator and is prepared to say the ugliest kind of things that people might want to say themselves. You couldn't imagine Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. This will appeal to our older listeners. And I'm not old enough to remember them. They were before my time. But even still, can you imagine an Adlai Stevenson and a Dwight Eisenhower speaking about each other with the kind of personal, poisonous insults that are routine today, or Richard Nixon and John Kennedy, they treated each other with respect. There was a certain kind, again, to use a Yiddish word, there was a certain kind of Menschlichkeit in the way they conducted themselves as national presidential candidates. But all that seems to have gone out the window now. And as you say, people cheer it. They think, yeah, I'd like to insult her myself that way, so I'm glad Trump is doing it. Not me. I think it makes this country just seem cheaper and sadder.
So if that's the case, if that sells, how do we turn in the other direction? How do we get better people in that public arena? How do we inspire people with gravitas? How do we inspire people with character to seek public office?
I'll tell you frankly, I do not know. I really do not know. I thought in 2016, when the Republican Party was taken over by the whole Trump movement, I thought it was going to be like the end of the Whig Party in the 1850s. There was the Whig Party, which for a brief period was the dominant party in American society, and then it just collapsed in all this animosity about the impending conflict over slavery in the South. And the Whig Party came to an end, and what was reborn out of the ashes was the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. And I found myself thinking naively, I guess, that Americans would not tolerate this kind of thing, but they have tolerated it. And when you say, how do we get more good people to go into politics and to raise the tone of our political discussions, your guess is as good as mine, because what I see are more and more good people leaving political office. Think of, for example, Ben Sasse.
Right.
He was an exemplary senator from Nebraska, thoughtful, intellectual, high ethical standards. And he decided, forget it. It's just not worth being in Congress if this is what life in Washington is like. So he left and he went to become the president of the University of Florida. And I see, this seems to be the norm. Either the people who do still have decent values decide to hang it up, or they just decide not to get into politics in the first place. I don't know. I mean, I think, maybe this is one of those cases where there's going to have to be some kind of unimaginable disaster that will finally wake people up. But who knows what it is? You remember, think back to the day of 9/11 or the day after 9/11. You're in New York, so obviously this, I don't have to tell you what a jolting moment that was. But do you remember that in Washington, D.C., hundreds of members of Congress, Republican and Democratic alike, stood on the steps of the Capitol and sang, "God bless America." To me, that has always been one of the most vivid, positive images from that terrible week. I wonder, will it take something like another 9/11, God forbid, for Republicans and Democrats to realize that maybe they do have more in common than they don't have in common? I don't know. As I say, your guess is as good as mine. I realize I'm not being very uplifting here, but I don't think there's a lot to encourage us.
So what's the role of faith leaders here? I mean, we're in the business of uplifting. We're in the business of being optimistic. There's hope for tomorrow. And yet we walk outside the sanctuary and we see a different scenario.
Well, I'm Orthodox. I go to Orthodox shul. It would never, ever occur to the rabbi of my shul to preach a sermon about politics. He wouldn't do it, and it wouldn't be accepted if he did. I'm not a rabbi. I'm not a man of the cloth. But what I would like to see from faith leaders, from clergy across the board, is less politics and more of an exhortation to people to respond to what Lincoln called the better angels of their nature. Instead of seeing, not to pick on any one particular group, but instead of seeing, these evangelical pastors rallying around Donald Trump and talking about how Donald Trump is God's gift to America and turning their whole religious message into a pro-Trump message, or the black pastors that are going to do the same thing for Kamala Harris, rather than see men and women who felt a calling to the life of religion, you turn that into political cheerleading or political demonizing of the other side. I would far rather see them using their influence to remind people that there's more to aspire to in this life than politics. And, that what you're ultimately judged by is not did your candidate win, or how many signatures did you collect on petitions, to put the candidate on the ballot, but rather, were you a good person? Were you an honest person? Were you ethical? Were you upright? It's a big order, whether rabbis and ministers and imams and pastors and all the rest of them are able to do it. I don't know. In the Jewish tradition, we've got all the books of the judges and the prophets who railed for years and years and years against the bad behavior of the people. But that's what I would like to see.
Yeah, how do we reconcile, our Judeo and Christian faith tradition, prophetic tradition, where we had a prophetic role to speak out in analysis and sometimes judgment of the spiritual, moral, social, and even political conditions of the society? How do we reconcile that with what you're presenting here about keeping it within the moral context?
Does it have to be such a contradiction, or rather, does it have to become a matter of politics? When the prophet Elijah had to deal with King Ahab, who was one of the wickedest kings in the entire Bible, and he's directed by God to go and rebuke Ahab to his face. Okay, he couldn't avoid politics. But for the most part, you go through the book of Jeremiah or Ezekiel or Isaiah or any of the prophets, you go through what Jesus had to say throughout the New Testament. You don't find them talking about, listen, vote for this one and not for that one. Right. Jesus might have said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and render unto God that which is God's. But for the most part, his message, drawing on messages of Jewish tradition for centuries beforehand, his message was one to the individual people listening to him, to be better people, to live more moral and ethical lives. And if somehow we could become a society that was gradually elevating the ethical tone, then I would think that better candidates would emerge as part of that transformation.
When I was in rabbinical school, I remember.
Go ahead, Rabbi. I'm sorry.
I remember the professor would say to us, "I know you're reading the Torah. I know you're reading the 5 books of Moses. Make sure you read the prophets. Because if you don't have that prophetic voice when you go down that pulpit, you're incomplete as a religious representative of our people."
Yeah, and contextually, Jeff, within the Black church, most of the change and response to the injustices in American society and the American experience have been championed by the Black church. But I do think it's extreme when we go from, and I'll be critical of my own faith tradition, when we go from Jesus as our personal savior and then turn to politics as our social savior, it becomes a problem because then we're disconnected from our values and what should guide us in terms of how we conduct. You agree or no?
I do agree, and I would apply the same thing to so many in the Jewish world, where you'll often hear people will talk about the Jewish prophetic tradition, but you dig down 1 inch, and it turns out that when the people who use that, what they're really talking about is more welfare plans, who was it that said, again, not to knock anybody, and I have many Jewish friends who are Reformed, but somebody's line was that Reform Judaism is it's the Democratic Party platform plus plus matzah on Passover. If the way you live religion or express religion or your religious values somehow always seems to come back to politics, then I would say you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And I would love to see the religious leaders in this country spending less time cheerleading for politicians and more time cheerleading for more ethics and morals and more honesty and more kindness and compassion from all of us.
Amen. Jeff, I know you have to go.
And also more tuning into the Rabbi and the Rev.
Now you got the right order. Thank you so much. By the way, Jeff, weekly email arguable?
So anybody can get my columns sent to them for free. Just go to Jacoby. What's my website? JeffJacoby.com. JeffJacoby.com. There's a link. You click on the link that says mailing list, and you can sign up. Anybody who wants to send me a note personally, I'm happy to respond. happy to set them up. My email address is jacoby@globe.com. I work for the Boston Globe, jacoby@globe.com. And yes, the newsletter is called Arguable, and if you Google it, you're bound to find a link as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so
always
much, Jeff.
Always
Appreciate
an honor to
Always
have
a
you with us.
pleasure. Let's not wait so long to do this another time.
Okay, you got it.
Absolutely. All right. God bless. And stay tuned for
care.
more of the Rev and the Rabbi right here on 77 WABC. We'll be right back.
Reverend A.R. Bernard, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, the Rev and the Rabbi. Talk Radio 77 WABC and the all-new WABCRadio.com.
Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
You know, Rev, as I was listening to Jeff, and to me, he's a very, very knowledgeable, he's an erudite. And it's really a pleasure to listen to him because you learn from him when you listen to him. But one of the things that I find very troubling is when people have this nexus between religion and politics, and you and I have addressed this many times. But I see these ads, Jews for this candidate, Jews for... What does it have to do with Jews? Why can't it just be Americans for this one? Or why do we have to make it a function of our Judaism? I don't understand that. Make all the arguments you want, but keep it separate.
Well, reality is that people groups within a pluralistic society like America experience life differently. So they're going to have, certain specific concerns. Like Jewish people, Rabbi, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have a threshold when it comes to a political candidate. How do they feel about Israel, and how do they feel about the Jews, right? The Jewish people.
Right. I get that. But very often the impression conveyed is this is the Jewish community speaking. And it's a group of and some of the positions of the people are supporting, I see, is antithetical to Jewish interests. So I'm very nervous when I see that. I've said many times, when a person of Jewish faith begins a sentence with, as a Jew, watch out with what's coming, because it's going to be some kind of insulting, derogatory comment about the Jewish people. And I just think we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. That's how they used to advertise Hebrew National hot dogs. But a higher standard, so that support a candidate, give the reasons for it, and I think people will respect you. But as Jeff said, in today's climate, it's the lowest common denominator, not the highest.
Yeah, and there's a lot influencing the collective consciousness in our societies today, Rabbi, especially with social media. And what he said about, emotional responses when it comes to voting. Here's what I discovered. People can subscribe to certain values, but at the end of the day, they vote their concerns. And sometimes those concerns put them in conflict with their own values. So if there is concern like the abortion issue, like Roe v. Wade, or like economics, quality of life issues, all of these things come into play, Rabbi, and they create a serious tension between the voters' values and how they actually end up voting.
Well, I can tell you this. When I voted, I learned this from my parents. The first thing that they worried about was the welfare of their own people, their own family. Who was good for the Jewish people? And also, not to be contradictory, who was good for the Jewish people was good for the American people. There wasn't a contradiction between the two. But I am very concerned with people who are ready to forego what is good for their own and sacrifice that for what they see as good for others. Social justice has become a paramount value, and I get it, but social justice in many quarters has devolved into helping others but not helping your own, and I find that sickening.
Now, when you say social justice, what side, left or right? Because when we look at spending patterns while we're here, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Republicans generally focus on what, Rabbi? Defense and military spending, right?
Right.
So they're going to allocate a significant amount, portion of the debt to maintain a strong military and national security. What's second on their spending agenda? Tax cuts and fiscal conservatism, right? So they're going to prioritize reducing taxes, supporting free market principles, and things of that order. Like when Donald Trump did his tax cuts, you know who benefited most. They're going to spend money on infrastructure. They're going to spend money on business and corporate interests. But when you look at the Democrats, at the top of their spending, social programs, then healthcare and education, environmental initiatives, and income inequality and workers' rights. So when you think about the layout of the voting population, they're going to tend to go in the direction of the party that's actually going to spend some money on their concerns.
I
If
think
you are working class and struggling poor and in need of a hand up, not a hand out, but a hand up, where are you going to lean?
mm,
Where the money is going to be spent.
yeah, I think what's going to be added to the mix this year is security. And I'm talking about the border. I think people are very concerned with what they see happening in our states, in our cities. You saw recently the bill for the migrant crisis in New York City is $5 billion. Now, when you allocate $5 billion for that means you cannot allocate other billions of dollars for other prioritized items. So I think that's going to be, and it impacts safety. So I think that is going to be part of the discussion and part of the decision that people make when they go and vote. I think safety is a major factor. Crime, major factor.
And notice how emotional that is. You and I have had several conversations on our program over the last year about New York City and safety. And we have the language, I don't feel safe.
Right.
Well, how do you measure that? You know what I mean? How do you respond to that?
Well,
When the statistics are saying, well, crime is going down, violent crime is going down, but I don't feel safe. And that's a tough thing to deal with.
yeah. And when I walk down the street and I'm a victim of an assault, it's even more difficult to accept
Yeah.
that statistic. You know, I remember a doctor saying, I can tell you that 98% of the people don't get this disease, but if you are the recipient of a disease, that statistic means nothing to you.
Right.
So I think it's, how we feel. Yeah, when we walk out the door, when we get on the train, when we interact with others. Talking to someone the other day who told me that a loved one was attacked on the street, 86th Street, struck from the back, knocked down. We saw our own colleague, Michael Miller, an e-bike struck him, broke a leg. When you read those stories, when you hear those stories, you say, where's the safety? How do we believe the statistic that it's going down when all around us we see people who are suffering?
Yeah, the statistics versus what people are experiencing. And sometimes the number of people who are experiencing these things are small in comparison to the larger population. But what is the media going to cover? They're not going to cover the broader population. They're going to cover those incidents, those, that happen that are extreme, and they're going to publish it on the nightly news.
One of the things I found compelling when Jeff spoke is here's someone who gives you free of charge. His email is arguable. It's called Arguable, and it's so worth reading. And you see the junk that comes across, your email communications. All the people send all these repetitive emails who don't have the depth of knowledge of a Jeff Jacoby and of others. We ought to spend more time, reading this guy's stuff than the other stuff that does nothing to enhance our understanding.
Yeah, it appeals to our emotions and, doesn't cause us to reflect, to think deeply about issues. There is a void, Rabbi, for critical thinking in our society. And some of it I understand because there's so much information coming at us. There was one study that says we experience some 700 gigabyte of information coming at us from the time we leave our home to go to work in the morning and the time we get home at the end of the day. So many voices coming at us, trying to influence us in political directions, in consumer directions, on and on and on. So when you get inundated by so much information, you become overwhelmed, and then you start looking for a trusted voice to process it all for you, and at the end of the day, tell you what to think. Not good.
We were taught when we were in school, at least in the graduate level, time management. You're going to go into your respective professions, learn how to manage time. And with everything that's thrown at us, the plethora of propaganda, the plethora of all these messages, you got to learn to rearrange. You got to learn to prioritize and say, where am I going to devote my energy? Because if you're going to spend all your time with the junk, you're not going to have time for the substance. So, that's why I
So who are the trusted voices? Rabbi, who are the trusted voices?
Besides you and me? Give
me a week. Give me
a week to think about this. Look, there are people I love reading. Brett Stevens. I like Jeff Jacoby. There are people I turn to because I trust their insights. And of course, read the traditions, read the Bible, read the prophets, look at the commentaries, and I think you walk away much more enlightened. And Jeff said something. You and I have said this. People who go, I was at your church last week. It was a magnificent experience celebrating your birthday.
And we were very, very honored by your presence, Rabbi.
Well, also to hear you teach, people were spellbound because they don't want to hear you talk about what's on the front page of the New York Times. They don't. And I know many people go to synagogue. They're not interested in the rabbi's, interpretation of newspaper headlines and newspaper stories. They are, there because they want to learn more about their tradition. What does their tradition have to say about some of the issues that are in the papers? But give me depth. Give me knowledge so I walk away knowing more than when I walked in.
Yeah. Give me that lens that I can look through to make sense of it all, but through the lens of my faith. Absolutely, Rabbi.
All right.
Hey, great conversation, Rabbi.
And Thank also you. Ava Anderson, who was our producer. We used to say Kevin, but now it's Kevin who? Ava Anderson is our producer and comes here faithfully, I would add, and does such a great job in making sure the program is audible.
And that's important in our business. Absolutely. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in to us every Sunday morning right here on 77 WABC for the Rev
and the Rabbi.
Till next time, God bless.